Hey everybody, Frank Markow here coming at you. Today we've got a really interesting topic, and that is interpersonal relationships in organization. Let's face it, if you work in an organization, you have a lot of relationships with different peoples. Your subordinates, your supervisors, your peers, your customers. There's a lot going on under the surface. Sometimes we just think you show up to work and it's all rational and matter of fact and goal oriented, but we know as human beings there's a lot of interesting intrapsychic dynamics and things going on under the hood. And so this lesson, based upon my book, will sort of dig into 4 areas related to interpersonal relationships in organizations. So I'm excited to present this to you. Hang on, we've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to get through this in a reasonable time. Now, if you recall from the early chapter in my book, we have different levels of thinking about organizations, and so this lecture is at that second level of organizational analysis, the interpersonal level. Now, the 4 topics we're going to talk about today are trust, psychological safety, work-family dynamics, and work friends. All right, so let's jump into the first one here, which is trust. Now, a gentleman by the name of Thagard defines trust as a brain process that binds representations of the self, others, and the situation and emotion into a special pattern of neural firing called a semantic pointer. So in other words, according to this perspective, trust is something that's sort of embedded in your brain that has become fused in there based upon your experience with other people, with situations, and with your own emotional content. And so it could be looked at as a combination of our regard for ourselves and others and how we feel about that relationship, conditioned by experiences, and they're hardwired into our brains over time. It's a conditioned response developed in time, built from experience, and embedded into our hearts and minds. And so this is why trust is such a complex and vexing sort of thing, because it builds in time, and it's embedded into our brain and our psyche, and maybe even our soul to a certain degree, right? Now, trust is essential for healthy relationships in organizations, right? How many of you like working in an organization where there's low level of trust, where you can't trust other people, where people don't trust you? That is not a very healthy organizational dynamics. And this low levels of trust can lead to playing it safe and low risk taking and what we call cover your rear end behavior. And so it's essential for healthy organizational function. And it's given in time to those we deem capable and of good character based on mutual connections with people. And it can be developed by way of experience and accelerated through foxhole experiences. So if you ever had this experience where you meet somebody or you know somebody and you kind of do something special, maybe you go on a trip, or maybe you're on a committee or a team or an event, or you do something and it's a little bit stressful, right? But you guys are together in this thing and you make it through, and at the end you kind of high five each other and you're like, yeah, we did it. Well, experiences like that build a lot of trust, and that's why a lot of organizations try to do these simulated trust building experiences, right? Sort of that falling backwards thing. It's like, okay, that was an emotional high risk situation, but I put my trust in you and you came through. So, how effective are those things? Well, we still do them, and I'm not suggesting you do those sorts of things, but, give people opportunities to work together and to establish that sense of trust over time. And it'll start to develop, right? So can we accelerate trust to a certain degree, but again, recognize that it's something that comes through the by and by, through repeated experiences, by positive experiences that we have in trusting other people. Now, there's an old saying here that I like: trust arrives on foot, but leaves on horseback. Now, what does that mean? It means it takes a long time to develop, right? So, think about it. When you first meet somebody, you're kind of looking at them and you're going, I don't know if I trust this person, So it takes time. So maybe you're new at an organization and you're not sure who to trust, who's trustworthy. It can take time to build that up. And maybe, I don't know how long, maybe a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, depending on how often you're together. But it can take a long time to build trust and really say, okay, I can let my hair down with this person. This person's not going to let me down. I can delegate to them. And this is oftentimes why, especially in ministry, people have a hard time delegating because they don't know who to trust, right? So pastors kind of hold on to things. They do everything themselves because they don't know who to trust. People have let them down in the past. They've sort of lost trust. So it takes a long time to build, but it leaves on horseback. So what does that mean? You can lose it almost instantly. So this is why, if you've ever had the experience of somebody who has broken your trust, maybe they did something that let you down, you automatically don't trust that person anymore. And so now you're always double checking them. You're always a little bit suspect. It's going to take time. It's going to take a long time to build that trust back up. So this is why it's so important not to lose trust with people, right? Because the minute you do something that breaches the trust, you're back to square one with that relationship, and you have to sort of build that trust over in time. Now, what are some things that are barriers? We call barriers to trust. So these are mostly things that leaders can do that will kind of put a barrier in there between other people trusting you. Well, the first one is inconsistent or grandiose messaging. And a lot of leaders like to come out and talk about all these things that they're going to do, or they say one thing one day and another thing the other day. Inconsistent behavior, right? So especially in leadership, saying one thing and doing another thing. So let's just say, it's important in that, we are customer focused around here. We're focused on people. And yet you don't see that leader actually doing that kind of, that sort of thing, right? Allowing problems to fester. So as a leader, there's something going on, but you don't address it. And so you want to address things quickly because people know, okay, he's looking out for me. He has my best interest in mind. He or she has my best interest in mind, and I can trust that person. Failure to trust others. So if you want other people to trust you, try trusting them, right? So it's a bit of a reciprocal thing here where people realize that you trust them, therefore they're going to trust you. Not dealing with elephants in the room. Right, and you see my nice picture over there of the elephant. Well, he's not really in a room; he's more of in a jungle. But sometimes, let's face it, there's issues going on behind the scenes, things that nobody really wants to address. And so leaders need to act quickly on things because everybody's looking at you and they're saying, well, is he going to address this? Is he going to deal with this? Is she going to deal with this? Or is she just going to kind of let this thing, fester and go on and wreak more havoc? And then making unequivocal statements, right? So these, again, kind of those larger than life. We're going to do this. We're absolutely, here's a classic one, right? Everybody's, and I know this can be kind of sensitive for some people, right? But everybody knows there's problems in the organization and money's tight, right? Some source of funding is dried up. And a leader will come out and say, nobody's going to lose their job. Nobody's going to lose their job. And everybody's, okay, that sounds good. And then next week, all of a sudden pink slips start flying out. So great. So even if you stick around, you're like, well, he said that nobody was going to lose their job, but 3 of my friends have lost their job. So, that's kind of a barrier to trusting that person in the future. So don't make statements that you can't back up. So how would you temper your enthusiasm for something like that? Say, well, there's a strong likelihood nobody's going to lose their job. However, we'll have to see where that goes. I know that's a delicate one, but try not to make promises that you cannot deliver on, right? What's that old saying? Under promise and over deliver, right? Okay, good. All right, so what happens when there is a breach of trust? And oftentimes this happens, right? So this is not the end of the world. It's a significant issue, but it's not the end of the world. So first of all, find out how the issue happened. Find out what happened. So what was the cause of the problem in the first place? Do a little bit of research. Do a little bit of digging. And again, this sort of assumes that it's not your problem, but something happened in the organization. Second is own up to it. Own up to what happened. Yes, we found out that this happened. We're not denying it. We're not sweeping it under the rug. We're not spinning it. Now, this happens a lot in organizations, right? Something happens, something really bad happens, there's a breach of trust, and the organization tries to spin it, say, well, it wasn't really that bad, or, it wasn't our fault, right? And this is where you kind of get into the ethical dimension, right? Taking ownership. And, we know that ethical lapses are going to happen, and fortunately we're seeing more organizations owning up to things. And we've learned in time that, because of this connected world, because of, the internet, social media, and all these sorts of things, people find out things pretty quick. And so to try to deny things or deflect it or say it didn't happen, that is becoming old hat. You have to own up to what happened in the contemporary landscape, even if it hurts, right? Take your spanks, take your punishment, and move on, right? So now you own up to it, but then the next step here is you have to make necessary changes. So it's one thing to say, yes, this happened. It's another to actually deal with it in a responsible way. Make changes in the organization where people say, okay, they screwed up, but at least they're owning up to it and they're making changes, and that's a good thing, right? And then stay in the game. Don't go dark. And again, this is kind of on an interpersonal level, right? Sometimes when something happens, we can check out. We can oh, I can't even deal with this, right? And people can't communicate with you. They're asking you questions, and you're just it's so painful for you that you can't really own up to this. That is not a good posture to take. Do the work you need to do, right? Stay in the game spiritually, emotionally, so that you now have the strength and capacity to actually deal with this on behalf of the organization. Okay, let's shift gears here. So that was the first idea. The second idea here in terms of interpersonal relationships is what is called psychological safety. Now, a scholar by the name of Amy Edmondson, who kind of pioneered this idea, gave a really good background here, and I'm just going to read through this. When people have psychological safety at work, they feel comfortable sharing concerns and mistakes without fear of embarrassment or retribution. They are confident that they can speak up and won't be humiliated, ignored, or blamed. They know they can ask questions when they are unsure about something. They tend to trust and respect their colleagues. When a work environment has reasonably high psychological safety, good things happen. Mistakes are reported quickly so that prompt corrective action can be taken. Seamless coordination across groups and departments is enabled, and potentially game-changing ideas for innovation are shared. All right, so this is a great overview of psychological safety, this idea that people are free to express themselves, to speak up without fear of retribution. That is kind of a more succinct definition of what psychological safety is. Now, Adam Grant, another good scholar in this area, said that a lack of psychological safety is lacking when this is how we know, this is a sign that psychological safety is lacking when people say different things behind a leader's back than to their faces. In the absence of trust and respect, we sugarcoat feedback to protect ourselves. In the presence of trust and respect, we grant truth to power, we speak truth to power, in order to help the group. Okay, so you can kind of see how psychological safety is related to trust, right? I sort of mentioned that when we talked about trust, but these are kind of interrelated ideas. And so if there isn't psychological safety, people tend to keep their heads down, they don't speak up, right? And, I can think of a good biblical example. Remember when David, this is in the book of 2 Samuel, I believe, when David messed up, right, when he had his affair with Bathsheba and he murdered her husband, along comes Nathan the prophet. And Nathan the prophet spoke truth to power, and he told David what was what. And David, had that right, humble response. He owned up to it. He didn't chop off Nathan's head, he didn't say, away with this fool, but he said, oh, you got me, right? He just kind of felt convicted in his spirit. Now, we're not all prophets, right? And a lot of our encounters with people are not going to be quite as dramatic. But, this kind of illustrates the safety that Nathan had in order to speak truth to power. So as a leader, you want to develop that kind of climate and culture where people feel free to speak truth to power. And another fable, it's not from Scripture, but you remember the one about the emperor with no clothes? right? This charlatan came in and made him a set of clothes, but actually it was nothing. And this guy was walking around like in his underwear, I guess. And everybody's, "Oh, king, you look great. King, you look great." And along comes this small child and says, "Hey, the king's got no clothes." Oh, wow. So that child felt more psychological safety than all those other people did. So they all felt like they had to placate the king, right? And sometimes in organizations it's like that. We're all placating the leaders. We're telling them what they want to hear. We're not really speaking the truth. We're not speaking our mind. Oftentimes that's because there's a lack of psychological safety. We have learned in time that this is not a safe place for us to speak up. But that is not a healthy type of organizational context. So there's different levels of safety, right? You don't just rush in and tell the king he's wearing no clothes, but you sort of develop this over time. So let's look at some of these stages. The first one is what's called inclusion safety. This satisfied the basic human need to connect and belong. At this stage, you feel safe to be yourself and are accepted for who you are, including your unique attributes and defining characteristics. So this is where you just kind of feel okay being part of the group, right? People accept you. Second stage is learner safety. This satisfies the need to learn and grow. In this stage, you feel safe to exchange in the learning process by asking questions, giving and receiving feedback, experimenting, and making mistakes. All right, so oftentimes, in organizations, we won't ask questions because we don't feel safe. But by allowing people to ask questions, right, we are sort of developing this, and it's okay. Nobody has all the answers. Nobody knows everything. And so we want people to ask questions. The next stage is contributor safety. This satisfies the need to make a difference. You feel safe to use your skills and abilities and to make a meaningful contribution. And the last stage is called challenger safety. This satisfies the need to make things better. You feel safe to speak up and challenge the status quo when you think there's an opportunity to change or improve something, right? So this is kind of the ultimate, where you are like, okay, I'm just going to speak because I see an issue here. I have something I want to contribute. I'm not afraid to challenge the status quo in order to make things better. So I'm concerned more about the overall group than I am about a person's perspective. Now, this doesn't mean you're disrespectful or you kind of blow people off or you're arrogant, those sorts of things. We do all these things properly and respectfully and whatnot. But when you've built up this kind of psychological safety, you have that perspective that I am free to speak up and challenge. All right, so how do we increase psychological safety? Well, here's a few ideas. Reduce status distinctions as much as possible. And a lot of times, in churches, other organizations, schools, like we, walk around with our titles, Pastor so-and-so, Doctor so-and-so, and that's appropriate, right? It's appropriate, but sometimes in interpersonal relationships, you kind of have to let those things down. So you have a meeting with somebody, oh, Pastor so-and-so, call me Frank, because that way people say, okay, now I don't feel like this person is over me socially. There's kind of a high status distinction. Another one is be explicit and give people permission to share openly. Sometimes people just don't know. Is it okay? Is it okay for me to speak my voice here? I'm new. I don't really know. So especially if you're the leader, you have to tell people, look, I value your honest opinion here. Please feel free to speak up. You are a valued member of the team, and we want your contribution, right? And then the last one is show genuine curiosity and a learning posture. So as a leader, if you express, inquisitiveness, people are going to be more free to feel safe and to speak up. If you come in, here's a surefire way to shut down, psychological safety, is you come in and you've got all the answers. Well, I've thought about this and here's what we're going to do. And everybody's like, oh, okay, well, I guess that's the way it is around here. I don't have a voice. I don't have psychological. I'm not safe to speak up, right? So you have to show a sense of inquisitiveness and draw people out. A good question by a leader, man, that can open up great conversations, learning, exchanging, collaboration. Goes a long way to building psychological safety and a lot of the things that come with it in an organization. All right, moving right along here. Let's talk about work family. Now, work, sometimes, we have this posture, we're one big happy family. Really? Family is so foundational to how we relate to others. Its dynamic can transfer to the workplace. And sometimes we kind of intuitively sense this, right? We've got our work bros and our work sisters and, maybe our work mom or dad, sometimes our work spouse, right? So we are all raised in families. And so this idea of family sort of like creeps into how we think about work in healthy and unhealthy ways. Let's talk about that. Now, Bowen, family system theory, this is an idea borrowed from the counseling and psychological world. It's a theory of human behavior that views the family as an emotional unit and uses systems thinking to describe the unit's complex interactions. So in other words, people, when they're in close proximity, their emotions begin to fuse and feed off and reinforce one another and sort of become locked into these interesting dynamics because of the way they've related to each other in time. And so we know that emotions in a system are shared with others in the system, and so we fuse with others in the system. I'm going to talk more about how we do that here in a second. So when we get in conflict with people, sort of in these close relationships, there's 4 postures. Family systems theory says that there's 4 postures that we can take. The first one is we distance ourselves. So in other words, either physically, we just stay away from that person, or psychologically we can distance ourselves. Have you ever been in a meeting, you're talking with somebody and they kind of say something that kind of like, freaks you out or whatever, and all of a sudden you're sort of psychologically distanced. You're like, okay, I'm here, but I'm not really here. I'm not present. I'm not listening. I'm not open anymore. So we kind of psychologically distance ourselves. Another family dynamic thing that happens is we can get into conflict and try to change each other. So it talks about conflict. It's not necessarily sort of this aggressive raising our voices or argumentativeness in family systems theory, but rather trying to change each other, right? So somebody says something to us and we push back, we challenge, we conflict, we kind of go against or whatever. So getting people to do what we think, right? So let's just say you're sort of the mom, or the dad. We try to lord it over. We try to persuade people to do things that we think they should do. Now, it might not be overt or aggressive. It could be very subtle, right? It's like, do you really want to do that? I'm not sure you really want to do that, right? And so we sort of like, subtly are trying to change their minds about things. Under or over functioning. All right, so this is interesting. What does this mean? This means that, let's just say somebody at work is not doing their job. And you say, well, she didn't turn in her thing on time, but you know what? I've got some extra time, sir. I'm going to go ahead and do her work for her. Or, this person doesn't really work that hard, so we're just going to kind of chip in and make it up. Because why? Because she's part of the family, right? We don't leave family members behind. We don't throw them under the bus. They're there. We're stuck with them. And so in order to make this dynamic work and to get work done, we kind of over function for people, and sometimes we underfunction, right? I guess I kind of skipped over that, but we underfunction, and an individual underfunction, they kind of like check out, and then the other people sort of compensate for them. And you see this in families a lot of time too, and the same dynamic happens in workplaces. And then creating triangles. All right, we love to do this one, right? This is where you have a relationship with, somebody, let's just say your sibling or whoever, we use this family analogy, and they say something that you don't like. And guess what? You go to dad and you say, can you believe what brother said, right? Can you believe what John said? He's like, yeah, I can't believe that, And so all of a sudden we're sort of sucking them into the emotional dimension, and they're getting upset about it too. Have you ever had that experience, where somebody comes to you and they talk to you about a person, they're kind of venting about this person, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, now that you mention it, that person really is a jerk. I've thought that too. What happened there? You got sucked into a triangle. They shared their emotions, and all of a sudden you had that same emotional content. And you weren't thinking 2 wits about that person before they walked in, right? You weren't mad at them or anything, but all of a sudden you kind of got sucked into the vortex of their own emotional angst. So, now, are any of these things necessarily bad? We all do this stuff, right? We all distance ourselves physically, emotionally. We all check out. We all help and cover for people. we try to change people, we triangle, we all do these things to a certain degree, right? So nobody is saying here, family systems theory isn't suggesting you can't do these things. They're natural responses to these dynamics. However, at work, they can become a problem when they're the pervasive, when they become pervasive and allow us to avoid dealing with difficult issues, and when they become fixed states and hijack our rational being. All right. So again, work needs to be based upon like actual goals and objectives and responsibilities and those sorts of things. So it's okay to, try to influence somebody. It's okay to help somebody out. But when you have a coworker who's persistently not carrying their work, when you have a coworker who's persistently drawing you into triangles or being drawn into triangles, right? And that becomes sort of the natural state of the relationship, state of the affairs. Now you're no longer functioning as healthy adults and doing your respective responsibilities at work. So another related idea here is what's called the differentiated self and the undifferentiated self. Differentiated self is the ability to separate one's self from the stress of emotions and the degree to which an individual can utilize his or her intellectual system independent of emotions and feelings and make decisions based on their own values and principles. Okay, so when you're differentiated, you are acting as an individual, whole being, irregardless of your connection with this other person. As opposed to the undifferentiated self, when we become so fused with the emotions in a system, we can no longer act independently, but rather move into our functional role in the system. All right, so this is an interesting one. Sometimes in organizations, according to family systems theory, we sort of lapse into these roles, these mother roles, these father roles, and these aren't always healthy. So let me give you an interesting example from my own experience. I remember I was on church staff for a long time, and I had a pastor who was very kind of domineering, and whenever I was oftentimes I was with him, I sort of felt like I was with my dad, and he was kind of telling me what to do and controlling me. And one time and so when I was with that person, I was kind of it was kind of like that family dynamic, right? And then I had a peer, and I remember having lunch with my peer, and we were talking, and he was asking me questions about things that I was interested in, so about education and teaching. And so I was in my differentiated self, right? We were two adults having an adult conversation about things, and then the pastor came and joined us. And all of a sudden, my perspective and my kind of like changed a little bit. I noticed myself kind of like quieting down a little bit and deferring to this other person. And I wasn't really my differentiated self anymore. I was now my undifferentiated self who had this fused emotional relationship with the pastor, right? So you see how that works? So when we are differentiated, we are working in our full rational, unencumbered self. But when we're fused and we're undifferentiated, we are not being as rational, and we're not contributing as much, right? In that situation, I was no longer like, who I really could have been to contribute to that conversation and to help that other pastor out. And so there's a tension that we experience in these relationships, right? We have a desire for individuality, the need that we each have to act autonomously according to our wishes, yet also wanting to get along with others in the system, and a desire for closeness, which may not allow for this individuality, as we feel we must do as others wish. In other words, we go along to get along at times in order to be part of the group, part of the relationship. All right, so this is a natural tension and a dynamic that we have, right? We want to be individual, we want to express ourselves, and yet we also want to get along and go along. Now, some people don't care about getting along, going along, and they're usually kind of the, abrupt people. They come in and they say whatever they feel, and they kind of blow everybody out of the water, right? You're like, wow, where did that come from? Like kind of like an emotional hurricane. They just came in. And then other people are like the total opposite, right? They're so undifferentiated, and they're like chameleons, and they just kind of go along, get along. They have no sense of self. They don't speak up, right? So the challenge here, the goal is to sort of find that balance between being individual and yet being part of the community, right? So kind of getting back to psychological safety. Does the culture and climate allow people to be individual where they're not sort of, clamp down into these roles, and they're forced to sort of act in these ways that, it's not healthy for them or healthy for the group. They're not contributing their full selves. So just some tidbits here for keeping relationships healthy. Seek to develop healthy emotional distance in any situation, right? So think about how you're feeling emotionally when you get into these relationships. Am I sort of lapsing into one of these roles, either being dominating of somebody or being dominated by somebody? So we don't want to check out emotionally, right? Obviously our passions, those are all important, right? We can't leave those things at the door. That's kind of a fiction that, like, when we show up to work, we're like these completely rational people and we don't have any emotions. That's nonsense, right? We bring our whole selves. God has created us to be these wonderful emotional beings. But you have to sometimes keep an emotional distance in a situation when you get kind of over-involved, over-enthused, or whatever it is. Note any tendencies you have to distance your relationships. That is, avoiding people either physically or emotionally. Now, this might sound contrary to what I said above, but sometimes remember that posture of distancing. Right? So we don't want to get overly emotionally involved, but we also don't want to sort of like check out emotionally when we're distancing in a uncomfortable way, in a way that becomes sort of dysfunctional. And then avoid becoming the triangle, avoid becoming the third party to triangles. This is hard, right? Because we like to talk and we like to get together and talk. And it's okay to listen to people. It's okay to share with people. But as soon as that emotional fusion comes in there, right, and all of a sudden you're being swayed and it's changing your opinions about people, that's never a good thing. And especially, pastors, those of you in ministry, that people come to you all the time. I mean, you are like, that's part of your job description, right, is to be that third node. And, it's okay, it's going to happen, but what is your posture? What is your response? How are you kind of emotionally connecting? Are you able to stay kind of neutral, push these people back to reconciliation, right? You don't want to be the one who's like, you got to be the parent here and you got to separate the two siblings. You're trying to create people who are healthy, who can go to each other if they have problems and talk to each other and kind of work their things out. Now, sometimes you need to be involved, but oftentimes people just want to draw you in. They want to suck you into their vortex and, spill their stuff all over you so that you feel the same way that they do about that person. That is never a healthy situation. You got to watch out for that. All right, and let's talk about the last thing here. Work friends. Now, I know as soon as some of you people saw that picture right there, right, from that old sitcom Friends, you started thinking of that song. Ding, 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 ding. All right, classic from the 90s, right? We love that show. These people, these people got so filthy rich off that show. Oh my gosh, they're all walked away millionaires. Anyhow, that's another topic. So let's talk about work friends for a minute. Now, we all need them. We all need work friends. Good work friends is an important driver in things such as work satisfaction, engagement, and reduce absenteeism, and reduces a sense of loneliness, which lead to lower productivity. So there's actually research on this one, right, that shows that having good work friends leads to some of these positive organizational outcomes. Lack of work friends can lead to a sense of isolation and alone in the crowd sensation without a soul to gravitate to or confide to. So maybe you've experienced both of these, right? Maybe you've experienced having good work friends, people that you can confide in, trust, triangulate with, right? People that you really like at work. Or maybe you've kind of experienced that, like, I don't really connect with anybody around here. I kind of feel lonely. There's lots of people and I see people relating, but I am not connecting with anybody here. I don't really have anybody I would consider a friend here. And so friendship, comes from the work of Shasta Nelson. Sorry, it took me a second to remember the author here. But she says that there's 3 pillars of friendship here. And so if you want to be a good friend, you want to try to have these things, to contribute these things, because you know what they say, if you want a friend, you got to be a friend, right? So how can we be friends to people? Well, the first one is positivity. People who make us feel good and are fun to be around. Work friends are those people who like us, support us, encourage us, and make us feel okay about being ourselves. Being with positive friends helps us feel satisfied. All right, so that's step number one, right? You need to be positive. You need to encourage people, right? Somebody that they like to be around. Nobody wants to be around like Debbie Downer, right? So don't be Debbie Downer. Be that positive person, and that increases your likelihood of connecting with somebody on a friendly basis. The next is consistencies. Spending regular time with people. Consistency has to do with proximity, how physically close we are to others, in other words, the office next door or down the hall, and the spontaneity, the ability to just happen to get together. Being consistent with others makes us feel safe. All right, interesting how this all kind of works together, right? Safety, friendship, trust, family systems, right? It's all kind of very interrelated. And so being consistent is an important part of relationships. And then, of course, vulnerability. The ability to show our true selves to others. Work friends know who we are and accept us regardless. We do not lapse into a functional role that is emotionally draining with friends, although this can occur. Being with good friends helps us feel seen, and we can be who we truly are. All right, so this is probably the best thing about friendships, in my opinion, is we kind of let our hair down, proverbially speaking, right? It's like we can kvetch a little bit, right? A little Yiddish there. We can kvetch. We can complain. We can talk. We can let them know what's important to us. We can let them know how we're feeling. We probably tell these people like maybe too much information, right? We just tell them this is what I'm thinking, this is what's going on. And hopefully they are encouraging, right? They are bringing some positivity and good feedback and insight. And these people know us, right? Our friends know us. They kind of know who we are. And they could say, yeah, I know this is kind of how you are and how you deal with things. But let me encourage you because I know how you are, and I want to help you deal with this situation. So, how can we be more intentional about developing work friends? Well, the first thing I want to say is be intentional about developing work friends. Sometimes, we kind of isolate, we kind of stick to ourselves, especially those of you who are more task-oriented. I know some of you are social, you're very social beings, and you don't need any advice on this one. You kind of already do this. So I guess I'm saying this more for the people who have maybe challenge, their friend challenge, right? The friendship challenge. They have a hard time developing these kind of relationships. So the first one is you accept and allow for friendships at work. Say, hey, I need to meet somebody. And my rule of thumb is, okay, this is me. I don't know if there's any research on this one, but my rule of thumb is you got to have at least one good work friend. You don't need a whole lot of them, right? Just like in life, we have our BFF. We've got our best friend, people we've known forever who, every time we may not have talked to them for a year, but we talk to them and it's like we just picked up where we left off, that kind of person. So try to find at least one person to establish a good relationship. Now, if you have multiple, that's great. But, for me, it's like, okay, if I got one good friend and I have one good friend, every time I go to work somewhere, I find that person. And I know it's intentional, but I just find somebody and, we end up being good work friends. Develop a diverse set of friends. All right, so I just said one friend, but be intentional, though, about who you develop relationships with, right? So don't say, I'm not going to be friends with that person because or whatever, right? We need different kinds of people, different parts of the organization, and this can actually help you, right? You kind of develop that social capital. Now, I'm not saying I'm not saying that friends should have this instrumentality to it, like we're only doing this because we want to, network, or we want to build social capital, or kind of ingratiate ourselves, right? I'm going to become friends with the boss, so that way they'll give me like favoritism. I'm not saying that at all, but just be intentional. Maybe people that are different from you, right? Maybe people from different background, ethnicity, race, gender, kind of reach out a little bit and develop a diverse set of friends. And then leaders. All right, I'm talking to you leaders right now. You need friends too. And this is an interesting phenomenon about leadership, right? Is that it's lonely. That old saying, it's lonely at the top? Yes, it is. So you have to be more intentional. And maybe it's not going to be your subordinates or, the people on your advisory team or your elders or, your board of directors, anything like that. But you need to find somebody that you can be yourself with and let your hair down and let off some steam with. That's important for you as well, leaders. Don't be that lonely leader. You got the Lord to help you, and find other people that the Lord can use to help minister to you and carry that burden that you have as well. All right, well, that's about all I want to say about that. I know we're coming in here kind of almost 40 minutes. Man, you guys hung in there. Thanks for hanging in. I hope this was helpful for you. If you hadn't read the book, I encourage you, pick it up. Pick it up and read it. This is all from chapter 5. I go into a lot more details in the book, obviously, but this is kind of a good whirlwind overview of everything I talk about in that chapter. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you, and we'll see you online.